Okay, so hello everybody. My name's David Beurle. I just got the word that we're good to go. So I'm David Beurle. I'm the CEO of Future IQ, and we're a research and consultancy company. And what I want to talk with you today about is thriving in a future world. And obviously, we're in really interesting times, and I want to just talk a bit about the importance of future thinking in this sort of environment, how we can go about that and get the most out of it. But also I want to talk particularly about what trends we're seeing that we think are really worth taking note of, and also sort of putting this period of uncertainty that we're in a larger context. How I want to do this is I've got a series of slides I want to run through, but I do want to break it up and have some discussion points along the way as well, and you'll be able to sort of send in questions or comments on chat, and then Chelsea will help moderate that. Okay, so thriving in a future world. So a little bit about Future IQ first of all. So we've been in business for nearly 20 years. Our footprint is primarily North America, Europe, Australia and other places. And we really work mostly helping people think about the future. So visioning, planning, and we work across a whole range of sectors, including manufacturing economies, resource-based economies. We do city planning, urban planning, work with regions and communities that depend on tourism and so on. And we try and, through all of that, we try and bring together this whole notion of thinking about the future in a clever way. In terms of what I'll talk about today, I'm going to draw from some of our foresight research. And we've done and published foresight documents around future food, cities of the future, implications of the next industrial revolution, the future of manufacturing and so on. These are all available online at the Future IQ website. But really at the heart of it, why I'm pointing that out is really at the heart of it is that we are keenly interested in how the future may unfold and what the implications are at different scales in society. So I'll talk today a lot about implications I see at regional scales, but you can also think about what some of these trends might mean for your own business and so on as we go through the presentation and discussion. So let's talk about the importance of future thinking. So I think probably more so now than ever before, we've all kind of had a bit of a wake-up call and a recognition that it's really important for us to think about the future in a different way. And one of the things that because our client sort of base is so broadly, both geographically but across so many sectors, is that as you know, and I sort of deal with it every day, is that every group is really thinking about how do we come out of something like a pandemic? How do we evolve? What's going to change? What's going to change permanently? What's going to be accelerated? What might go back to normal and so on? And I want to explore that with you today. But of course, dealing with change, and we're all in the midst of a very profound set of changes. And what we know is that the factors that create change can be quite complex. And while obviously a pandemic can be a trigger, there are a lot of other things that are going on as well, which create this complexity in the world we live in, wherever we are at the moment. And of course, that higher degree of uncertainty and it leads to a reduced predictability about the future. And of course, that leaves us, many of us feeling confused and wary about the future in terms of what should we do. When's the next sort of catastrophe arriving, or how fast should we move and so on. Yet one of the things in dealing with that change is that can kind of paralyze people. But we can still anticipate certain things will change and trends will emerge and evolve and create new trajectories. And that's what we want to explore today. And the keys to future thinking are to explore and anticipate like this range of plausible futures, to like really think about what might be sort of a range of possible outcomes, best to worst. We've probably all been doing that. A piece that I think is really important that often people don't, I think, pay enough attention to is to think about trajectory. So the direction of change, as well as the velocity, so the speed of change. And speed of change is really critical. And then we've got to be able to also put that together and understand and explore the combined impacts of multiple potential trends at the same time. So if you take, for example, right now, we're dealing with, say in the US, dealing with, a pandemic, profound change to how we can interact in society. We're dealing with social issues that are coming to the fore, the Black Lives Matter sort of process, and then you've got a whole bunch of other issues at play in the same time. And so being able to think about how those trends might interact becomes really important. But the magic of it all is that it alters our perception of how certain decisions may play out over time. It leaves us better informed. So part of what I want to walk through today is to sort of lay down what I think are some of these key trends we should be thinking about at whatever scale of planning we're doing. So, and what we've been doing is trying to understand and think about trends in a couple of different sort of categories. So which trends are being amplified and accelerated by the pandemic and this period of uncertainty? So which ones are those? And we want to talk about those and have some discussion. What changes might be more elastic? And what I mean by that is elastic is something changes, but the moment in this case, the pandemic goes away, it all snaps back to just the way it was, right? So which changes might be elastic and which might be more inelastic? In other words, which changes are perhaps really significant sort of forks in the road where we're going to see different types of things evolve, and where are potential tipping points. So where are we at the point of things may profoundly change forever? So let's have a look at these, right? Let's look at which trends are being amplified and accelerated. So this is not intended to be the exhaustive list. It's intended to be a number to prompt some discussion, right? So one of the things we're seeing is the reinvention of cities, and the majority of people on the planet live in cities at the moment. We'll talk about that, but the technological impact on cities and how cities are functioning has been changing for the last number of years, and there is no doubt that that's being amplified and accelerated. The number of cities right now that are stepping forward with sort of accelerated changes to things like pedestrian spaces, changing the relationship between cars and people, public spaces, how we use public spaces and so on. And no doubt that's going to be continue as we go forward. One that's right in the wheelhouse of today is the application of automation and robotics. Every sector you look at, I think people have realised that one of the major vulnerabilities in manufacturing systems is the human element. And you have a workforce that gets sick, or for some reason you aren't able to work, then that can just be a spanner in the works, of course, right? So I think the application of automation robotics is going to be accelerated dramatically, and I want to talk a bit more about that. Instant health data. Obviously, that's something that's going to be with us now. Personal recognition and tracking, so facial recognition and tracking. So being able to know people, where they are, what they're doing, how they're moving. Airports are ramping that up. I think we're going to see that, this is a massive amplification, acceleration. And of course, the obvious one is online commerce and retail, and how that's changing as well. But I wanted to sort of point to this, and hopefully you can see my little cursor here. So this talks about digital technologies, and you could take the case that the last century has really been defined by a piece of technology which was the internal combustion engine, and that shaped most things that have happened in the last century. But we're at a point where something different's happening here, and this chart here is cumulative capability on the vertical axis and a timeline on the horizontal axis, on the x-axis. And this looks at things like mainframe, cumulative capability of sort of mainframes, client servers, web commerce, and so on. But you'll see here that we have this bundle of technologies that have really sort of reached that exponential point in the period we're in right now. And that's things like the Internet of Things, smart machines, big data analytics, cloud computing, and so on. And what that's created is an environment where artificial intelligence has been able to accelerate in terms of its performance and its application. And if you think about this, if you take the case that artificial intelligence may be the foundational technology for the next century, and we're very much at the very start of it, and we think that that's something that's going to be amplified and accelerated, what might be the implications of this even over the coming years, let alone the decades? So that's one trend that we're watching very closely. And if you put it in this sort of context, the question is, when will machines outperform people? And this is from a sort of a Delphi study that was Oxford and Yale universities. Start off 2022, folding laundry, translating languages, driving a truck, writing high school essays, writing books, working as a surgeon, and really to the point where in 2060, artificial intelligence will be able to do all human tasks and better than humans. And so in this period, we're seeing this profound transformation, and this is, in our view, this is just going to be accelerated. So the next, say, 5 years is going to be a really critical time in terms of the impact of artificial intelligence on our manufacturing environments and our social environments, and in fact every dimension of our lives. And then, of course, if you take a more closer look at manufacturing, we've had the sort of digital continuum, the lean continuum. People have worked really hard on the lean continuum for many years. The digital continuum is really starting to advance. But of course, the bigger issue is at some point we're going to see androids and advanced robotics enter into these systems, which replaces people to a large degree. And what then becomes the role of humans in the workplace, and what happens when you remove humans, and when will this happen? So they're sort of items we're exploring. And for some people, that could be fantastic, right? There could be all sorts of benefits and solutions at a societal level, at a human level. Other people talk about it more as a dystopian future where, human beings become somewhat redundant to the system. Well, we'll see, I guess, in the coming years. But I wanted to just sort of have an opportunity to have either answer questions or have some discussion here through the moderator. Just in terms of, these are some trends that we've identified that we think are being amplified and accelerated, and I'll talk about ones that I think that may be more elastic or inelastic, and what are tipping points. But in terms of these, we talked about reinvention of cities, automation, robotics, instant health data, personal recognition, facial recognition and tracking, online commerce and retail. What do you think the implications of these trends, if they're amplified and accelerated, what are the implications of that on a manufacturing economy, a region and businesses? So let me go to what changes may be more elastic, right? So, and what I said is about elasticity. It's that change occurs, but there's often a sort of a tension that wants to pull change back. So, and that's a function of human beings aren't necessarily great at embracing change, and we sort of go back to our habits quite quickly, or our established systems. And there's a sort of phenomenon in my mind which is, the longer an interruption lasts, the less elastic change becomes. So, for example, in this case, there's a lot of people working at home because of the requirement of the pandemic. Well, at some point, if the pandemic stops, how quickly do we all just snap back and go back to work as we were? Or at what point does that become actually an inelastic change? And some of the ones I wanted to just talk about are mass urbanisation, and I picked that out because a lot of people are sort of talking about, there's this urban flight, and there's lots of anecdotal information about housing prices sort of having a bump in sort of spaces around mega cities and metropolises. Financial equality. This is a really interesting one. A lot of countries, a lot of people have been putting in place processes to basically create sort of a sustainable income for people while unemployment has spiked dramatically. Does that sort of safety net, does that stay, or does that disappear when things go back to normal? Working from home, really interesting one. At what point does working from home become working from anywhere, right? So, and exploring that. Nationalism and globalism. So obviously we've been in a period of intense globalism. Right now, most borders of countries are closed to easy passage of people for health reasons and others. Do we end up in a more nationalistic world, or does globalism sort of re-emerge as some of the constraints start to remove? And then there's the shifting global world. So I just want to talk through some data points in this and then come back for some more discussion. So the future of urban living is a really interesting one, right? And we're in this period actually between 1950 and 2050 where humanity is making a massive pivot from being primarily agrarian rooted species to an urban dwelling species. And I want to show you some of the data on this. And I would argue that this pivot is accelerating. And there are all sorts of implications, even in manufacturing, for when people become an urban dwelling species. There's a lot of manufacturing has been driven for many years based on skill sets of people who grew up in agrarian type environments. You know, people who grew up on farms, went to factories, you know, became machine workers and so on. Well, what happens when we have very few people in these environments that have those sort of natural maker sort of skills embedded in them? And let me just show you in terms of this trend line in terms of numbers. So this is 1950. This is the global population. So what this is this is a map of the world. So here we have the North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. The size of the circles and the numbers, you know, portray the number of people who lived in cities of over 100,000 people. So that's the definition of urban in this case. So at that point, 101 million people lived in urban environments in the US, and it was about 64% urban at that point. So it's in that category of 50 to 75. So this is 1950. If you go forward to 2020, you see a dramatic change. Let me just toggle backwards and forwards. So 1950 to 2020, right? And so we have this absolute explosion in terms of the number of people who live in these large urban environments of over 100,000 people. You know, nearly 1 billion people in China living in large cities, and even in the US, we're nearly at 300 million people living in cities in the US alone. But it's a global phenomenon, you know, and just in the US, there's 50,000 people a week being added to city populations through either migration or birth in cities and so on, and that's added as net. So this pivot's well underway, and at this point, you know, we're now talking about, you know, around 80 to 90% of people in the US are living in urban environments. But if you fast forward this to 2050, then you see that same trend line just dramatically expand across the world, where, you know, most of Europe, most of the Americas, more than 75% of people, and in fact, in developed countries, you're really starting to look at around 90% of people live in urban environments, has all sorts of macro implications. And if you just think about it in our lifetimes, essentially, the humanity is going from being spread across the planet to being concentrated in these mega cities. What's the implication of that? I personally, and people do say the pandemic's causing an urban flight. I'm sure there's examples of that. I don't think that's a trend that will reverse. I think that's going to continue. I think the urbanization, I think we're past the tipping point on that. I wanted to also just talk about changes in consumer spending power. So this is global wealth in a way. This is middle class consumer spending, and this is a pie diagram here that is color coded to the map of the world. So each major region of the world is color coded. So Asia Pacific is the orange, North America is the light blue, Europe's the dark blue, and so on. And this is change in middle class consumer spending power between 2009 and 2030. So, and we're obviously right in the middle of that period. And so the inner circle here is the 2009. The outer circle is the 2030. North America, if you take that for example, the middle class consumer spending power is forecast to go from $5.5 trillion to 5.6. So no significant gain. Europe, some modest gain, but the massive growth, almost 600%, is occurring in Asia Pacific. And why is this important? Well, because when people get into the middle class sort of categories, they have disposable income and they start to buy stuff and they start to travel. And it's the buying stuff that drives a lot of the manufacturing, because that, you know, is the goods that people consume and so on. But there's this macro shift occurring in where global wealth and where the spending power of the world is going to be. So let's have some discussion or questions if there are any, Chelsea, on this one here. What are your views about which of these trends do you think are more elastic or inelastic? I think the trend towards mass urbanization is just, if there's a little blip on the curve, I think it's going to return to that very quickly. I think we're well beyond that. I think financial equality, that's been a fascinating social experiment, but I think most countries I'm seeing, you know, it's back to the way it was fairly fast. One here, working from home. that's a little bit more interesting, right? That could be quite an inelastic change, right? I think there's an enormous appetite. About 50% of the workforce, as you'd know, is really saying, I just love to keep working from home. About 50% wants to go back to the office. But I think the bigger issue here is, like I said earlier, work from home could be work from anywhere. So if we kind of level that whole system and people are able to work from computers or conduct business via platforms like this, how easy is it then just to go to another location where cost structures might be different and so on? Nationalism and globalism, we'll see on that one, of course. Shifting global wealth, I don't think that's going to change. But Chelsea, let me just stop there and see if there are any questions or comments that I could interact with. If you're listening, Chelsea. Okay. I'm assuming not then, right? So I'm going to keep going to the next one. Sorry, let me just skip. Oh, yeah, right. So the last sort of big bucket I want to talk about here are tipping points. And I just from our work, and as I've mentioned, we've done a lot of sort of foresight work, both at a research level, but also working with our clients around the world. And I think we're at the point of a number of really substantial tipping points that I think are going to be enhanced by the global pandemic and the times we're in. And what I mean by tipping point is where things change profoundly, right? It's systemic change, and you reach a new sort of stability in a new system. And I think we're at a point of some really critical tipping points. And I just want to walk you through some of my thinking on this. And why I say this is that these tipping points are going to shape the very world we're in, and they're going to shape our workforce, and they're going to shape our economic landscape and so on. Societal values, right? I want to talk a little about that, about global equality, inclusion and collaboration. I want to talk a little about humans living in insular bubbles. We quite literally have been driven into bubbles in many cases to stay in our own smaller bubbles. What's the long-term implication of that? Environmental awareness, the sort of pressures, obviously, of climate change, which are leading to dramatically new and different weather patterns and intensity of events. Travel and tourism industries, and the transformation of the global food industry. So I just want to talk through some of these tipping points. So I've got here a couple of age pyramids. So I have one from just to show you sort of developed countries. So the United Kingdom and the United States. United States is on the right-hand side. These are 4-year age increments going up through the scale, male, female. And the red arrows here on the side point to two significant bulges that we're familiar with, right? We've all talked about the millennial bulge and the baby boomers, right? And it's mirrored almost perfectly in the UK, and similar version in most developed countries. Here's the issue, is that in the next few years, right, in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a significant influence shift in society from baby boomers to millennials. And that will bring with it a whole raft of different societal values and different appetites for change. And in our work, our planning work, we work with everywhere from high school students through to senior company and civic leaders. And I can tell you that our sense of it is that there's a real pent-up demand for change and for issues to be addressed that have not been addressed in society. And our forecast is that this decade is going to see a lot of this societal change emerge. And I keep talking about it. It's like the level of change that occurred in the 60s, where there was this shift in sort of generational groups, and there was this explosion of creativity, new thinking, ideas, lots of kind of upheaval. So it's not always pleasant. There can be a lot of sort of system change. There's always friction and debate around that. And I think you're starting to see some of that now. The Me Too movement, for example, some of the attention that's been gathered around youth voice in climate change issues, Black Lives Matter, that's become a global phenomenon. So in this next decade, we're going to see a lot of societal tipping point change is our forecast. Another underlying issue that's going to drive a lot of what we see at a macro scale is resources for a growing global population. So the forecast is by 2050, we're going to increase the global population by 25%. But that doesn't lead to a uniform increase in resource consumption. So this is a primary level resource, but think of this as also, flows on into manufactured goods and so on. But food, 60% increase in the demand of food, 50% increased demand in energy, 40% increased demand in fresh water. And why that's all more than 25% is that a lot of the growth is where people are coming out of agrarian poverty. And so they're starting to move into those middle class consumer spending patterns. And so per capita, their consumption of these sort of resources starts to go up. This is going to be a very significant issue for the world of how we deal with providing this additional food, the constraints of fresh water, energy. If you look at that, that's really interesting. In the last decade, there's been a fantastic transformation in the whole energy story, where we were looking a decade ago at really a prognosis of energy shortage, because we're reaching peak oil in fossil fuels and so on. But of course, the advent of solar and many other renewable energies has totally changed the equation for energy. I would argue that the same type of change has to occur in the areas of basic resources like water and food. That same sort of transformation that's occurred in energy has to occur for us to be able to provide these basic resources at a global level. Let me just give you a little bit of a context for this, which is looks at this one here, looks at the projected impact of climate change on agriculture, for example. And the reds and the browns is where the forecast is where crop yield or crop agricultural productivity is going to decline really dramatically as a function of climate change and all of the factors that go with it. So you're seeing right through the equatorial regions of the world and primarily the southern hemisphere, this potential loss of productivity. At the same time, most of the world's population growth is occurring through, and the fastest growing areas are these parts through Sahara Africa or equatorial Africa, India and so on. So we've got more people, but their ability to be able to produce their own food starts to decline. The interesting thing on this though is North America, because a significant part of the US and Canada are in areas where there's a forecast crop yield productivity increase will occur as a function of climate change, longer growing seasons and things like that. So very interesting that there's this sort of like very different outcomes in different parts of the world. If you overlay that with where people are currently hungry, and this looks at world hunger, this is data from last year, you can see world hunger is primarily focused in Africa and parts of India and Asia. This is where the same thing is happening. The ability to be able to produce food is declining and the population is growing dramatically. So this is setting everything up for really a global issue about how do we start to think about this disconnect between where food can be grown and where resources are and where people are going to be. So there's going to be this sort of, either it's going to drive a lot of innovation, or there's going to have to be some radical rethinking in terms of how food is distributed in the world and how food systems, for example, function. But you can cascade the same type of thinking down and think about it in terms of manufacturing, where goods are going to be demanded and so on. So just a few thoughts on this, right? And so just to tipping points, I've talked about that. I think we're no doubt at a level of a societal tipping points at a global level. And while it's pretty rough right now, I do think in this decade, we're going to start to see a lot of issues start to get addressed in different ways, equality, inclusion, collaboration. I might be the bleeding optimist, right? But if you look at history, the optimists generally prevail, right? I do think we're going to see some really macro level collaboration start to emerge and different levels of global cooperation. And that's going to be driven, I think, by different voices that are coming through that are going to be shaping society and values around the world. I mean, we didn't look at the data, but there's a massive cohort of young people in the world who are coming up through the developing countries who are going to be, technologically savvy. They're going to have access to the world. and they're going to, I think, give a different voice. Humans living in insular bubbles, this is a really fascinating one from our perspective. We are in physical bubbles in many cases. People have had to split their workforces to have A teams and B teams, or we're in, restrictions of movement and so on, gathering sizes. But we were already starting to move to live in insular bubbles. If you walked through any public space at any time, people have got their heads buried in their device, right? And they're actually in a rich world. They're in a bubble, right? It's a virtual bubble of some sort, interacting with people, interacting with, sort of groups of people and so on, but in these bubbles. And I think, if you couple together the emergence of these macro metropolises and technology and our desire to be sort of get the experience we want, I think people are going to be increasingly in these insular bubbles. That's going to be interesting from a point of view of how society evolves and how people interact and how people learn and so on as we go. Environmental awareness, I don't think there's kind of much doubt that there's going to be a global reckoning in terms of climate change and how we deal with that. In terms of what are the implications, I just talked about some of the implications of the level of food, but if you just look at the size of fires, for example, that we've seen in California, the size and intensity and frequency of hurricanes, everything's just going off the charts, right? So that's going to lead to a really significant tipping point, I think, in terms of how we adapt to that changed environment and how we might mitigate, further acceleration of that. Travel and tourism, interesting one. There's a lot of debate about this, right? We work with a lot of tourism destinations. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with that. We've seen a massive pivot now in terms of people now suddenly discovering there's actually some pretty good things close to home. And so regions that are close to major metropolises may, in fact, many of them are seeing substantial upticks in domestic tourism. I don't think that's going to go away quickly. I don't think people are going to be rushing back to a plane even when things are resolved. I mean, obviously it's going to move on, but the real point of that is that destinations are starting to push back and say, this wasn't working for us. We don't want to have over tourism, so there's a lot of pressure for transformation of that type of industry. And then, of course, the global food industry. And as I said, that's the big one from our view, is that 25% increase in global population, 60% increase in global food demand, consumption, and already our environment's severely stressed by many major farming producing areas. So that's one that's going to be, I'd say, some really substantial transformation. I think agriculture and food is going to look very, very different in a decade's time than what it does today. So, I should go back. Chelsea, were there any questions or comments on this one? Is there anything in the chat or the feed?
Yes, David. Our first question is, do you really believe the population will grow considering the impact of technology? I would argue that people want less and less to do with people. Technology doesn't argue. If you don't agree, you simply swipe it away.
Yeah, so the question, the core question there is do I think the population will grow? Well, I think the global population growth is already baked in. Many of those people are already alive, right? And I think the biggest cohort that's coming is young people in the developing countries, and they've not really, there's hundreds of millions in each of those age sort of platforms in the developing countries. So we just haven't seen the full effect of that yet in the world. So I mean, quite likely, and most of the forecasts are that global population is going to peak at around 9 billion, and what are we're 7 and a bit now. I don't think population growth is going to be dramatic I don't think those trends will change. I don't think in developed countries it's going to change much, but in developing countries it already is growing rapidly. I think what we just haven't dealt with is the knock-on effects of that as those people go through into consumption patterns and so on. Was there another one, Chelsea?
The second question is, given these trends, what are you most optimistic about and what are you most concerned about?
Yeah, good question. All right, so here's what I'm most optimistic about, right? I think that we could be in a period where technology becomes the solution, and I think a lot of these issues that look like they're unsolvable, right? So climate change, how do we decarbonize? How do we do all those things? Well, pollution in the oceans and so on. If you look at say the 60s, right, and you look at and I keep wanting to compare the 60s to the 2020s, because I think we're going to see a similar leap occur in the 2020s as we saw in the 60s. And if you look at it from what you can be optimistic about, well, technology is one. And if you look at it from the start of the 60s, it was let's talk about this fanciful idea of putting a man on the moon, and yet at the end of the decade that had occurred. And what I look at is I look at that accelerating growth of artificial intelligence, and already artificial intelligence is being applied to solve all sorts of what you might call grand challenges. The rapid scanning of literature to look at potential vaccine solutions or solutions to antibiotic resistance and so on. There are so many aspects that are already being shaped by artificial intelligence that I think that's going to be a huge plus. The other thing that's coming at the same time is that young people who are much more technologically literate are also very hopeful and very keen to see technology deployed to help solve issues that we haven't been able to solve so far. So that's what I'm most optimistic about, is the impact of technology and how that could accelerate solutions. I think the area that I kind of get concerned about is that the transition, to me, could look a little bumpy and ugly. And I'm talking about the transition from generational cohorts in society. And I think we're already seeing that in the landscape in a number of countries. You can look at Brexit debate in the UK, or you can look at the election in the US, and you look at other developed countries where there's similar sorts of tensions going on, and really it's sort of a battle for a prevailing point of view or a view of the world, right? And no doubt, demographics will win the day. People grow up and they become voting age. People end their lives and so on, right? So retire and move out of the system. But we are for sure in the next 5 years going to see remarkable increase in influence of the younger voices. You can go to conferences now, for example, and the mix of people who are in the room is changing really quite rapidly. I think that transition could be pretty bumpy, because there's a lot of cost in what we're going to have to deal with in the future if we start to think about these sort of massive changes in consumption patterns around the world and issues. For most of us in our lifetimes, we haven't seen a significant tragedy of a poverty event or a famine in the world where people have died in large numbers. We're certainly seeing it in a pandemic, but I think that it's going to be a bumpy ride. But I do think that the end point is going to be sort of breakthroughs in solutions, if you want to look at it like that, as in the 60s, where a lot of energy was applied and people came together in new combinations to find solutions. I think we're going to see the same thing in the 2020s. Is there any others, Chelsea? Sounds not. So let me go to my final piece here, right, which is sort of to play off that a little bit. I want to talk about my predictions and observations, right? So, and I really was just talking about this. The next decade is going to see waves of accelerating change, and I use waves in the plural there. They're going to be both societal and they're going to be technological, and that's going to be two things. It's going to be the size of those waves, the number of those waves, and the speed at which they move. So we're in for this period of accelerated change. So you sort of hang on and be in the race, right? The second point there, which I have touched on, is that humans, I think we have to think now that humans are an urban dwelling species, right? And many people still live in rural environments or small cities or satellite cities or towns and so on. I understand that, but the sheer numbers of people who are now just their entire life is defined and by inhabiting a metropolis somewhere, and that's going to just reshape humanity. I can't even begin to think the full effects of having a whole species that basically becomes an urban dwelling species. The flip side of that, of course, is that I do see a lot of the sort of non-urban areas, agricultural areas, continuing to depopulate, or the emergence of specialised cities, which which would be defined by their proximity to the major metropolises. That they would be satellites around those big concentrations of people, and they would likely have specialised functions, manufacturing cities and so on. But this period is going to demand something from us all, right? It's going to demand that we accelerate change or lose, and there's no other choice, right? It's either we have to be accelerating with the speed of change, or we're just going to get left behind. And the reality is, I think people and businesses and locations are going to get left behind in increasing numbers. But there are those that will pivot and accelerate and change and be part of the different future. And the last point is that planning will require creating flexible, well-informed plans. We don't have much predictability, and I think we're not going to have any predictability for quite a while. We can have some sort of forecasting about plausible futures, but we have to be able to build agile and adaptable plans and grounded in understanding trends, because that's the only way we can really anticipate where certain changes may occur. But we're going to have to be able to adapt fast to changes that come. And with that, I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity, right? And in the middle of a pandemic, having a title like "Thriving in a Future World" is sort of maybe a little bit of an oxymoron, right? But it's really interesting, even in this period, right, that there is so much innovation occurring. People are adapting so quickly. It's really remarkable in a way that the world didn't stop. Our borders are closed. All sorts of things have happened. But the world has gone on, and I think that points to the resiliency of systems and people. But I would just conclude by once again highlighting, that I am a little bit of the optimist, right? And I do think that we are in for sure a bumpy ride, but I think the outcomes of this could be really quite remarkable for people and for industries, and I think manufacturing economies and so on. There's a lot of upside as we look forward into the future. So with that, I'll just finish my comments. And Chelsea, can I hand it back to you, or are there any final questions or thoughts that people would like me to interact with?
Yes, so we have a few questions for the Q&A part. The first is, how do we address the growing gap that is anticipated to occur between those who can keep up and those who cannot? Yeah.
Okay. So that of course is the issue, right? And and that's why I was talking about financial equity. That right now, there's mechanisms put in place to basically a safety net for people, right? I think we've always had people who couldn't keep up, and or economies or businesses that the world changed on, right? I just think it's going to get more intense, right? And I think society has to figure that out. But the issue, there's sort of different scales of issues. So that's an issue in the level of inside a country or inside of a society. How do you take care of the people who are disadvantaged or left behind? And we've looked at some of that. I mean, if you just take, for example, the trucking industry, how long before most of the long-haul truck fleet in the US, for example, is going to be autonomous? Likely it'll be within 10 years, you would think, or a big chunk of it. But that's a lot of people whose job it is to drive those type of trucks, and they get displaced. And how transferable are their skills and so on? So I think there's going to be a lot of that sort of retraining, retooling, and society's going to have to come up with creative ways to deal with that. But society generally has in the past in other major shifts like that. You see that in post-depression, post-Second World War and so on. I think there's also a bigger issue here too in terms of the gap between countries that have resources and the countries that don't, right? And I think that's sort of going to put a lot of pressure on human mobility on the planet, which is people who are going to be fleeing areas that are more difficult to inhabit, or even getting close to impossible to inhabit, and then all the conflict that goes with that. So if you have, shortages of food, that leads to competition, that leads to, sort of fights and battles and wars and so on over diminishing resources. Those issues become really critical, and I think that's going to require a level of global cooperation that we probably haven't really seen since post-Second World War. That would be my presumption, and I think what's going to drive some of that is going to be the basic resource competition around what drives food and so on. Chelsea, next question.
The next question is, how will the dynamic growth in consumer spending in Asia and relatively low growth spending in North America impact importing and exporting? Will Asian nations be less eager to export their products as domestic consumption grows? Will American exports grow as overseas demand for goods increases?
Yeah, good question. And that ties to the nationalism versus the globalism, right? So depending how that turns out, Chelsea, I've got do you want? Yeah, thanks. Depending how that turns out, I think that's going, like the globalism nationalism sort of tug of war, how that turns out, it's going to have a big impact on that, because if we're in a globalized world, that growth in middle class consumer spending power in Asia Pacific, that could be a boon for a manufacturing community anywhere in the world, right? Because they're going to be consuming more, and of course remember that ownership of companies that are embedded in those different locations is also part of a multinational ownership pattern. If we see a stronger push towards nationalism around the world, and starting to erode trade corridors, then you sort of more come back to, the big driver becomes more about population, which is, if you track long term in history, population is a key driver for economic activity, because it's, people consuming things. So there is a danger if sort of borders get drawn too tight or trade gets interrupted, that countries that have capacity and technology like the US may actually get locked out of markets that are growing quite rapidly in different kinds of ways. So I think that's one to watch, right? I will say though, I do think that we're going to see an era of cooperation emerge in a way we haven't in recent decades, right? And I think that's going to be driven by a shared understanding that we live on one planet, and a climate crisis globally is going to require us to cooperate differently. I just think we're going to have to get back on that track, just at the level of humanity, putting aside all the perspectives on it. I mean, this is going to demand a macro solution, and I think even the pandemic is, to some degree, there's been a lot of collaboration going on behind the scenes. And you're going to see global solutions come out, where there's vaccines, and already you can see there's funding being applied to distribute those to poor countries or countries with less resources and so on. So there's a whole layers of global collaboration that are being formed that I think are going to be applied to a range of issues like the pandemic or like climate change and so on. Chelsea, is there another question?
The next question is, do you think that the meltdown of incumbent retail business as a result of the pandemic will create an opportunity for new entrepreneurs to lead a renaissance of city living, or is this accelerating the exodus of people from cities?
Yeah, good. Yeah, and good question. I did touch on that. I do think we were already seeing that trend. So this is one probably that's being amplified and accelerated, is that we're already seeing traditional retail struggling, right? We're already seeing the conversion of retail stores in downtowns and metropolises into WeWork spaces and things like that. And things like universities starting to move campuses into areas that had, available, space. And quite likely, I think the whole online shopping is just going to continue to accelerate because there is so much efficiency and technology built around that. What that, of course, leads to is this whole continued reinvention of what it's like to live in a city, right? And I think this is a really interesting area where there's going to be a lot of creativity, which is, if you look at it like historically long term, it's really only in the last 80 years that cities have become sort of more interesting habitable places. I mean, prior to that, they were often disease-ridden in some ways, heavily polluted, even in more recent times. But we are getting to a point where I think with a combination of, sort of public resource management, health management, design, infrastructure, that cities have become and are becoming much more habitable places, right? And then if you start to think about, couple that with, there's going to be an increasing trend towards at least more work from home, if not exclusively, then where people live inside of a city becomes part of their bubble, right? And so one of the things, if you look at some of the trend lines at the moment, there's a few things going on, right? So sort of first ring suburbs are undergoing a sort of an urbanization where you're starting to see a lot of the sort of amenities that would be associated with a city centre are now starting to be found in, sort of micro versions in first ring suburbs. Further out on the peri-urban space, there's lots of gentrification of rural areas that are right on the fringe of metropolises. But I think a lot of it's going to come down to is that people are going to be living in these communities that are embedded inside these big metropolises. And those communities are going to be complete packages. It's where people can basically, spend most of their time working, they live, they recreate, and so I think at that scale, that's where we're going to see a lot of kind of that innovation occur in terms of the scale of delivery of like health services that get, delivered into those communities. The sort of lifestyle of, parks and streets. There's all sorts of work being done to think about how you create these very livable communities that are embedded into a macro metropolis, and these, could actually end up being fascinating places to live that have everything you need right there within, walking distance. And that, interestingly, is an aspiration or an appetite that is shared by the two big major population bubbles, baby boomers and millennials. They both share that same desire to have those livable, walkable kind of spaces that are their neighbourhood or their community that's embedded in this mega metropolis. Any other questions, Chelsea?
And the last question is, how will consumer and government debt shape the economy of the future?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one, that's for sure, right? So, but the thing is, we know for sure is that there is a piling on of public debt at the moment that is obviously just massive, right? And how that works its way through the system, I don't think we know yet, right? The one thing that is interesting is that it's been pretty much uniform across the world. I mean, similar to the response to the global financial meltdown 10 years ago or more, the pandemic and the impact of that has really caused governments to take very similar types of approaches around the world to shoring up the economy, and that in most cases has been basically the trade-off of budget balances into big deficits that pushes the problem down the track. So how that winds out of the system is yet really to be seen, right? And there's probably, I mean, you could couple this then with some of the generational change that's occurring. You may start to see more appetite for solutions that are more level playing field, right? I mean, I think people have become increasingly agitated between the gap of wealth between the majority of people and the sort of few more wealthy people. I think some of that's going to unravel in some form, right? But the interesting thing is that this is really a global phenomenon, right? So it's not necessarily a massive competitive disadvantage because basically every country sort of had to apply the same sort of approach. but I do think there's a fair bit of unraveling that has to happen. How they go about it, I really don't have a huge insight into that. All right, so Chelsea, I think that's it, right? So I'll just finish up and then hand it back to you. So again, I just want to thank everybody. You know, it's really, I think these are really interesting discussions, and I appreciate the questions. So thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in the event today.